It was a cloudy day, with a light rain covering the streets of the bustling city of Monterrey. The droplets hit the ground in a steady rhythm, forming puddles on the sidewalks and making the car lights reflect brightly on the wet asphalt. In the distance, the imposing Cerro de la Silla stood tall, wrapped in mist, almost as if watching over the city from its throne. The streets seemed to mirror the sadness of those walking under their umbrellas, hurrying to find shelter in some warm, dry place. The gray clouds swirled in the sky, as if sharing the unease of the people. However, inside a mansion located in one of the city's most exclusive areas, the atmosphere was entirely different. Within its walls, Martín, a successful businessman who had climbed to the top of the business world, was preparing for his regular visit to the local orphanage. It was a ritual he repeated every month, a way of giving back to society what life had given him. Despite building an empire that spanned from technology to fashion, Martín had always maintained a humble lifestyle, far from the excessive luxuries that usually surrounded people of his status. His home was large but simple, every corner reflected his character and the values with which he had been raised. That morning, the cool, damp air from the rain woke him with a feeling of melancholy. He stood by his bedroom window, watching the raindrops slowly slide down the glass, forming unpredictable paths. His thoughts wandered back to his past, to the difficult moments he had faced in his childhood, when poverty and uncertainty were his constant companions. "I never want to forget where I come from," he told himself every time he thought of the children at the orphanage. Martín sighed deeply before putting on his coat, preparing to leave. He had decided to bring provisions to the orphanage that day, food, clothes, and some toys that he knew would make the little ones smile. He climbed into his truck, a practical and modest vehicle despite his wealth, and after starting the engine, he began driving through the wet avenues toward his destination. The orphanage, El Hogar de los Pequeños Corazones, was on the outskirts of the city, in a less developed area with streets that seemed forgotten by time. Despite the distance, Martín visited frequently. He felt a special connection to the place, a sort of moral debt he couldn't ignore. From a young age, he had felt a deep empathy for orphaned or abandoned children. He knew what it was like to be hungry, to feel invisible, and he didn't want those children to grow up without the hope of a better life. As he drove, his thoughts focused on the faces of the children living at the orphanage. Every time he visited, he saw their eyes filled with unanswered questions and unfulfilled desires. They were children who didn't know the warmth of a family or the laughter of a safe home. Years ago, Martín had decided he would do everything possible to bring a little joy and relief to those young hearts. Finally, he arrived at the orphanage just as the clock struck 10 in the morning. The director of the place, Señora Isabel, a middle-aged woman with a serene and compassionate demeanor, greeted him at the door with a smile that lit up her face despite the gray sky. "Martín, it's such a joy to see you," she exclaimed enthusiastically, greeting him with a hug. "The children always look forward to your visits. You bring them more than food and clothes, you bring them hope." Martín smiled warmly as he stepped out of the truck. Despite the success he had achieved in his professional life, this was the kind of recognition he truly valued. Not the kind that came with awards or applause, but the kind that came from knowing he was making a real difference in the lives of others. "It's my pleasure to be here, Isabel. I brought some things I hope will be useful," he replied, pointing to the boxes he had loaded in the back of his vehicle. Together, they began unloading the supplies. Some volunteers from the orphanage also joined in to help organize the boxes in the kitchen. Over the years, Martín hadn't just contributed financially, he had ensured the orphanage's conditions improved. Thanks to his efforts, the orphanage had been able to make repairs, expand some areas, and even hire additional staff. He knew that his contribution went beyond material things, and that gave him a sense of purpose that even his business successes couldn't offer. Once everything was in place, Martín decided to take his usual walk through the orphanage, greeting the children and making sure everything was in order. As he walked through the hallways, he observed the children's drawings hung on the walls and the toys scattered across the rooms. Every corner of the orphanage was a testament to the life that blossomed there, a life filled with laughter but also with absence. As he passed the playroom, he stopped to watch a group of children playing cheerfully with dolls and balls. Their laughter echoed in the space, filling the room with a warmth that contrasted with the gloomy weather outside. However, among all those happy voices, a solitary figure caught his attention. In a corner of the room, away from the rest, a girl of about 8 years old sat silently, her gaze fixed on the floor. Her dark brown hair fell in messy strands over her shoulders. Her large, expressive eyes seemed filled with a sadness that didn't match her age. Something about that image moved Martín deeply, as if an invisible hand had gripped his heart. He approached slowly, not wanting to frighten her. He knelt down beside her to be at her level and spoke with a gentleness only he knew. "Hello, little one. Why are you sitting here all alone?" he asked, his voice soft and understanding, careful not to invade her space. The girl slowly raised her eyes, as if deciding whether or not to trust this stranger. There was caution in her eyes, but also a flicker of curiosity. "I don't like playing with the others. I'd rather be alone," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was almost inaudible. Martín felt a sharp pang in his chest as he heard those words. He knew from experience that many of these children had gone through painful situations that had marked them in ways that were hard to repair. The loneliness this girl expressed wasn't something typical for someone her age, it was a learned loneliness, the result of wounds that had yet to heal. "That must be hard," he commented, his tone filled with understanding. "But I want you to know you're not alone. I'm here, and I'd love to get to know you better if you'll let me." The girl looked at him with a mixture of doubt and hope. For a few seconds, she seemed to weigh whether she should open up or keep protecting herself behind the wall of loneliness she had built. Finally, as if something in Martín's warmth gave her the trust she needed, she responded more clearly. "My name is Julia." That name resonated in Martín's mind with unexpected force. He stood there, motionless, as something inside him began to stir. It was as if that name and those eyes were pulling buried memories from deep within layers of pain. Julia. It was a common name, but there was something about the way she said it that felt strangely familiar. For the next few minutes, Martín continued talking to the girl, asking her about her life at the orphanage, about the games she liked, about what made her happy or sad. As the conversation progressed, Julia seemed to relax little by little, as if Martín's presence provided her a momentary refuge from her own thoughts. When he finally said goodbye, promising he would return soon, Martín couldn't help but look into the girl's eyes one more time before leaving. There was something in them that haunted him, something he couldn't shake off. As Martín returned to his truck, something inside him had changed. He couldn't get the image of Julia out of his mind, her sad eyes and the melancholy tone in her voice. As he drove back home, memories began flooding his mind like an unstoppable tide. Martín remembered his wife, Laura, with a clarity that surprised him. He had loved her deeply, and losing her had been devastating. That accident had marked him for life. He remembered the last day they spent together, the sound of their little daughter's laughter in the back seat, the way Laura had looked at him with tenderness as they drove through a rainstorm much like today's. And then, the crash. The chaos, the screams, the pain. It had all happened in a matter of seconds. Martín had survived, but his world had been shattered. His wife died instantly, and their 2-year-old daughter disappeared in the wreckage. For years, Martín had lived with the hope of finding his little girl, searching for answers, chasing any lead that might shed light on what had happened. But over time, the authorities stopped looking, and he had to face the possibility that his daughter had also died in the accident. The emptiness left by that loss stayed with him for years, until he decided to fill his life with work, building an empire to avoid the pain. But now, sitting at his desk in the mansion, he looked at the old framed photograph of Laura that he always kept on the table. His wife smiled in the picture, a smile that had always been able to light up any room. Beside Laura, she held their daughter in her arms, a little girl with the same eyes as Julia. Martín felt a sharp pain in his chest. Could it be possible? Could Julia, that lonely girl in the orphanage, be his lost daughter? The resemblance between Julia and Laura was striking, especially in their eyes, so deep and expressive. Martín stared at the photograph for long minutes, unable to tear his gaze away. Julia's name, her age, the way she spoke, everything seemed to fit. But how could it be? How was it possible that his daughter had ended up in an orphanage without anyone knowing? That night, he barely slept. His thoughts assaulted him again and again. What if he was wrong? What if Julia wasn't his daughter? How would the girl react if it turned out he was her father? Was he ready to face those answers? His fears consumed him, but something was stronger than his doubts, hope. A hope he hadn't felt in years. The next day, unable to wait any longer, Martín returned to the orphanage. This time, he didn't bring supplies, he had a much more personal mission. He needed to talk to Isabel and find out more about Julia's past, about how she had come to the orphanage. "Martín, what a surprise to see you so soon," Isabel said with a smile as she greeted him, but she quickly noticed the seriousness on the businessman's face. "Is something wrong?" "Isabel, I need to talk to you about Julia," Martín responded bluntly. "There's something about her that I can't stop thinking about. I feel like there's something I need to know." Isabel invited him into her office, where they sat across from each other. Martín explained how he had met Julia the day before and how something about her had moved him in an inexplicable way. "Isabel, I think she might be my daughter," he finally said, feeling the weight of the words resonate in the small office. "I know it sounds impossible, but my daughter disappeared in an accident many years ago, and Julia, everything about her feels so familiar." Isabel looked at him in silence, surprised by the confession. Several seconds passed before she spoke. "Martín, this is a huge revelation. But you must know that Julia has been through a lot in her life. She arrived here about 6 years ago when she was found abandoned on the outskirts of a small village. We don't know much about her past, only that she was moved from one hospital to another before finally being brought here." Martín felt a knot in his stomach as he listened to those words. Hospitals, transfers, everything sounded disturbingly familiar. How could no one have connected this girl to the accident that had destroyed his life? "Isabel, I need to know more. I have to find out if Julia is my daughter. Everything matches almost impossibly. I don't know how she could have survived without me knowing, but I need the truth," Martín said with determination. Isabel nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. She, too, seemed overwhelmed by the possibility that Julia might indeed be Martín's daughter. "We can talk to her, but we must be very careful. Julia is a sensitive child, and any news about her past must be handled delicately," Isabel said in a gentle but firm tone. Martín knew Isabel was right. Julia's life had been marked by loneliness, and any revelation about her true identity could destabilize her. However, he also knew the truth had to come out. He couldn't ignore what he felt in his heart. Julia was his daughter, he knew it. Now it was just a matter of confirming it. After speaking with Isabel, they agreed that the best course of action would be to have a conversation with Julia in a calm and private setting. The director went to fetch the girl while Martín waited in the office, his heart pounding in his chest. How would Julia react? Would she be able to accept what he was about to tell her? Julia appeared a few minutes later, accompanied by Isabel. Her large eyes looked at Martín with curiosity and a bit of nervousness. She knew something important was about to happen, though she didn't understand exactly what. Martín knelt in front of her to be at her level and gently took her small hands. "Julia, I need to ask you something very important," he began, his voice soft but filled with contained emotion. "Do you remember anything about your life before you came here? Do you know anything about your parents?" Julia furrowed her brow, as if trying to remember something from her past. "All I know is that my parents died in a car accident when I was very little," she responded, her voice laden with sadness. After that, I was brought here. Julia's words were like a dagger to Martin's heart. Everything fit. It was her. Julia was his daughter. He felt the air escape from his lungs, but he knew he had to stay calm. He took a deep breath before speaking again. Julia. I think I'm your dad, he finally said, his voice trembling with emotion. The girl looked at him with wide eyes, clearly confused and overwhelmed by what she had just heard. Really? She whispered, as if afraid to believe it. You're my dad. Martin nodded, feeling the tears begin to well up in his eyes. Yes, sweetheart. I think you're my daughter, the one I thought I had lost forever, he said, his voice breaking with emotion. Julia remained silent for several long seconds, watching him as if trying to process what she had just heard. Finally, without warning, she threw herself into Martin's arms, hugging him tightly as she broke down in tears. Martin held her with all the love he had kept inside for so many years, feeling the emptiness in his heart begin to fill. Tears of relief and happiness streamed down his face as he held his lost daughter. I'm so sorry, my love, Martin whispered between sobs. I'm so sorry for not finding you sooner. Julia said nothing, but she clung to him as if she never wanted to let go. In that moment, Martin knew that nothing in the world could separate them again. After legally confirming that Julia was indeed his daughter, Martin took her to live with him. The first days were an emotional roller coaster for both Julia and Martin. The girl, who had spent so many years in an environment where affection was limited, found herself overwhelmed by the warmth and love her father gave her. The enormous change in her life was, at times, difficult to process. The mansion, with its spacious rooms and gardens, initially seemed intimidating to her. She felt out of place in such a luxurious environment. However, Martin did everything he could to make Julia feel comfortable, making sure she knew that this place was her home too. They spent long hours together, talking, playing, and discovering things about each other. One afternoon, while they were walking through the mansion's garden, Julia suddenly stopped, looking up at the cloudy sky with a thoughtful expression. Dad, what happened to Mom? She asked suddenly, with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Martin felt his heart clench. He knew that question would come sooner or later, but reliving that pain was never easy. Even so, he understood that Julia deserved to know the truth. He knelt in front of her and took her hands. Your mom didn't survive the accident, sweetheart. It was a terrible tragedy for both of us, he responded with a shaky voice, fighting to hold back tears. Julia looked at him in silence, processing the news. The sadness on her face was clear, but there was also a kind of acceptance. After all, she had spent so much time without knowing about her parents that, in a way, she had already internalized the loss. I miss you, Mom, Julia whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. Martin hugged her tightly, allowing himself to cry too. It was a shared pain, a wound they had both carried for a long time, but one they could now begin to heal together. I miss her every day too, Martin responded, gently stroking his daughter's hair. The hug lasted several minutes, during which time seemed to stand still. For Martin, it was as if the pain he had carried for so many years was beginning to fade, if only a little. He knew this was just the beginning of a new life for both of them, a life they would build together. As the months passed, Julia began to adapt to her new life, though it wasn't always easy. Despite the love and security Martin gave her, there were moments when the girl felt overwhelmed by the radical change she had experienced. After years of living in the orphanage, surrounded by other girls in humble conditions, life in a mansion full of luxuries felt unreal, almost as if she didn't deserve it. One afternoon, while they were both sitting in the living room, Julia remained silent for a while, staring at the lit fireplace with a pensive expression. Dad, can I tell you something? She finally asked, her tone uncertain. Of course, my love. You can always tell me what you're thinking, Martin responded, moving a little closer to her, ready to listen. Julia looked at him with eyes full of emotion. Sometimes I feel like I don't deserve all of this. The house, the toys, your love. I spent so much time without anything that I don't know how to feel now, she confessed, her voice trembling. Martín felt a sharp pang in his heart as he listened to those words. He knew that Julia still carried the emotional weight of her past, the years of loneliness and abandonment at the orphanage. He moved closer to her and hugged her tightly. Julia, you deserve all of this and much more. You're my daughter, and nothing makes me happier than having you here by my side. You'll never be alone again, I promise, Martín said, softly kissing her forehead. Julia clung to him, feeling the warmth and love she had longed for envelop her. Little by little, the weight on her heart began to lighten. She knew that, in time, her emotional wounds would heal, but she also knew she didn't have to face them alone. From that moment on, they both decided to focus on building a life full of love, leaving behind the pain of the past. Martín was determined to make sure Julia had a happy childhood, one that would make up for the years of suffering she had endured. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Martín and Julia began to find a routine that allowed them to enjoy their time together while also growing as individuals. Despite his success as a businessman, Martín dedicated much of his time to being with Julia, taking her to extracurricular activities and encouraging her interest in art and music. One afternoon, while they were strolling through a music store, Martín noticed that Julia stopped in front of a beautiful black grand piano. "Dad, can we have a piano at home?" Julia asked, her voice a mix of timidity and excitement. Martín smiled at the excitement in her eyes. "Of course, sweetheart. If that makes you happy, I'll buy you the best piano we can find." Julia beamed with joy and immediately chose the grand piano. That very afternoon, they had it delivered to the mansion and placed in the main living room. From then on, the house was filled with melodies as Julia practiced every day, perfecting her musical talent. Martín watched her proudly every time he saw her playing, knowing that his daughter had found a passion that brought her joy. However, despite the happiness they shared, Martín noticed that Julia was still carrying questions about her past, especially about the accident. He knew he couldn't keep postponing that conversation. One day, after dinner, Julia sat beside her father on the couch in the living room, her expression serious. "Dad, I know we talked about the accident, but I want to know more. I want to understand what happened that day," she said firmly, though her voice trembled a little. Martín looked at her, and though his heart filled with sorrow at remembering the tragic event, he knew he had to be honest with her. He explained everything he remembered. The rainy night, the truck that hit them, how he had escaped the car injured but alive, while Laura and Julia were trapped. The paramedics arrived quickly, but they couldn't save Laura. When they pulled Julia from the wreckage, they thought she hadn't survived, and somehow, she ended up being taken to a different hospital. That's where he lost sight of her. Julia listened in silence, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Julia," Martín said, his voice breaking. "I tried everything to find you, but the circumstances were confusing. The only thing that mattered to me was getting you back." Julia looked at him with eyes full of understanding. She knew her father had done everything he could, and now, the most important thing was that they were together. "It doesn't matter what happened before, Dad. What matters is that we're together now," Julia said with a faint but sincere smile. Martín hugged her, feeling the relief and peace settle in his heart. As time passed, the bond between father and daughter grew stronger. Despite her painful past, Julia flourished in her new environment, not only in music but also in her studies. With each passing day, she felt more at home, surrounded by the love Martín gave her. For Martín, Julia became the reason to keep moving forward. His life, which had been empty and lonely for so many years, was now full of purpose. Watching Julia thrive filled him with pride and happiness. One day, while they were having breakfast on the mansion's terrace, Julia asked an unexpected question. "Dad, have you ever thought about having more kids?" she asked, looking at him curiously. Martín was surprised but then smiled. When your mom and I were together, yes. We wanted to have a big family, full of love. But after the accident, I thought that dream was no longer possible, he responded sincerely. Now that I have you, I feel like I have everything I need. Julia smiled, but there was something else in her eyes, an idea that had been on her mind for a while. It's just that. I've been thinking. What if we adopted a child from the orphanage, she said, a bit nervously. Martín looked at her, surprised, but quickly understood where that idea was coming from. Julia still felt a deep connection with the children at the orphanage, and she wanted to offer them the same opportunity she had been given. Would you like that, Julia? Martín asked, with a warm smile. Yes, Dad. I think it would be wonderful. There are so many kids like me who need a family, and we have so much love to give, Julia responded, excited. Martín remained silent for a moment, reflecting on the idea. Then, he smiled and nodded. If that's what would make you happy, then we'll consider it. Because family isn't just about blood, it's about love and commitment, he said with determination. Julia looked at him gratefully, and without warning, she threw herself into her father's arms. Thank you, Dad. I love you so much, she exclaimed. I love you too, my love, Martín responded, hugging her tightly. Years passed, and Martín and Julia's lives continued to transform for the better. Julia became a talented and successful young woman, excelling in her studies and her passion for music. She decided to pursue a career in medicine, inspired by her desire to help children who, like her, had faced difficult situations. Martín, for his part, found a balance between his business and his family life. Although he remained a successful businessman, his greatest pride and happiness came from watching his daughter flourish. The day Julia graduated from university, Martín surprised her with some news. Sweetheart, I know how much you care about helping others, so I've decided to do something special. I bought a small hospital in the city, one that was in bad shape but has a lot of potential. I want you to run it and turn it into a place where you can make a difference, Martín said with a smile. Julia's eyes filled with tears of emotion. Really, Dad? That's incredible, she exclaimed, throwing her arms around her father. Thank you, thank you. Martín hugged her tightly, feeling his heart swell with pride and gratitude. They had come a long way, and although the past had been filled with pain and tragedy, the future was full of promises and opportunities. Together, they had found the happiness they so deeply deserved. The future for Martín and Julia was bright, with the certainty that no matter what fate brought, they would face it all as a family. Years passed, and Julia flourished in her role as the director of the small hospital Martín had bought for her. She quickly gained a reputation for her compassionate care and innovative approaches, especially with children who had suffered trauma, much like she once did. Under her leadership, the hospital transformed into a beacon of hope for the community, attracting attention not only locally but also from across the country. Her dedication and drive inspired others, and Julia's work became her passion, filling her with a sense of purpose. Meanwhile, Martín, though proud of his daughter's success, began to feel the weight of his own legacy. His business empire, which had once been his refuge from pain, now felt distant. He had delegated much of the work to trusted executives, and although he still managed the company, he felt that his true passion lay in supporting Julia and giving back to society. His wealth, once a symbol of his triumph over hardship, now felt like a tool he could use for a greater good. But as the years passed, Martín noticed something troubling. Julia had become so engrossed in her work that she rarely took time for herself. Though she loved her role, the long hours and emotional strain of working with traumatized children began to take a toll on her. Martín watched as his once vibrant daughter grew more fatigued, her smiles less frequent. One evening, while they were having dinner at home, Martín gently broached the subject. Julia, I've noticed you've been working non-stop. You're doing incredible things, but I'm worried about you. When was the last time you took a break? Julia sighed, her shoulders sagging. Dad, I know I've been pushing myself, but there's so much to do. The children need me, the hospital needs me. If I slow down, it feels like I'm letting them down. Martín reached across the table and took her hand. I understand, but you also need to take care of yourself. If you burn out, you won't be able to help anyone. Julia nodded, though her expression remained tense. Deep down, she knew her father was right, but the thought of stepping back, even for a short while, filled her with guilt. I'll think about it, she said softly, though neither she nor Martín believed it would happen soon. As Julia continued her relentless work, something unexpected began to unfold at the hospital. A new doctor, Dr. Andrés Valverde, had recently joined the team. Charismatic and talented, Andrés quickly became well-liked among the staff and patients. He was confident, sometimes to a fault, and brought fresh ideas to the hospital, which both challenged and intrigued Julia. At first, their professional relationship was cordial, though somewhat distant. Julia admired Andrés' medical expertise, but his confidence sometimes bordered on arrogance. Over time, however, as they worked together more closely, a mutual respect began to develop. Andrés pushed Julia to think outside the box, to question her established methods, and while this led to some friction, it also sparked an intellectual connection between them. However, as their partnership grew stronger, an undercurrent of tension emerged. Andrés had his own vision for the hospital, one that involved expanding its services and bringing in more private funding. He believed that with his approach, the hospital could become a leading institution on a national scale. Julia, on the other hand, was wary of turning the hospital into a commercial entity. She feared that it would lose its focus on helping the most vulnerable if they became too dependent on private donors. Their disagreements began to spill over into meetings, where Andrés would subtly challenge Julia's leadership in front of the staff. If we don't adapt, we'll fall behind, he said one day during a board meeting. We need to attract bigger investors, modernize our facilities, and hire more specialists. This is the future of medicine. Julia, feeling cornered, responded firmly. I understand the need for progress, Andrés, but not at the expense of our mission. We exist to help those who can't afford care anywhere else. We can't lose sight of that. Though the conversation ended there, it marked the beginning of a deeper conflict between them. Over the next few months, their disagreements became more pronounced, and Julia began to feel the weight of Andrés' ambition pressing against her values. The turning point came when Andrés secured a meeting with a prominent pharmaceutical company interested in funding the hospital's research department. Though Julia had reservations, she agreed to meet with the representatives, hoping to find a compromise that would protect the hospital's mission while allowing for growth. However, during the meeting, Julia realized that Andrés had already made promises on behalf of the hospital, promises that involved compromising the care they provided to low-income patients in exchange for research funding. Furious, she confronted Andrés after the meeting. You went behind my back, Julia accused, her voice shaking with anger. You promised them things I never agreed to. This hospital was never meant to serve corporate interests. Andrés, unflinching, met her gaze. You're too idealistic, Julia. If we don't evolve, this hospital will die. We need that money to survive, and sometimes that means making tough decisions. Julia felt a surge of frustration and betrayal. She had trusted Andrés, but now it was clear that his vision for the hospital was fundamentally different from hers. I won't let this hospital turn into just another business, she said firmly. If you can't respect that, maybe you shouldn't be here. The conflict between them escalated, and soon it became a topic of discussion among the hospital staff. People took sides, some agreed with Andrés, believing that change was necessary for the hospital's future, while others stood by Julia, defending her commitment to the hospital's original mission. The stress of the situation began to wear on Julia. She found herself doubting her own decisions, wondering if Andrés was right, and if she was holding the hospital back. Meanwhile, Martín noticed the change in his daughter and felt powerless to help. For the first time since they had been reunited, Julia seemed distant, lost in her own struggles. The tension between Julia and Andrés reached its peak when an internal vote was held to decide the hospital's future direction. It was a critical moment for Julia. If the board voted in favor of Andrés' plan, the hospital would change forever, and Julia would have to make a decision about whether to stay. On the day of the vote, Julia arrived at the hospital early, her mind racing. As she walked through the halls, she saw the children playing, laughing, and it reminded her why she had fought so hard to keep the hospital true to its mission. This wasn't just about numbers or growth, it was about the people whose lives depended on the care they provided. In the boardroom, the atmosphere was tense. The vote was close, and Julia could feel the weight of every decision she had made leading up to this moment. When the final tally came in, the board had voted narrowly in favor of her vision for the hospital, rejecting Andrés' proposal for corporate funding. Relieved but exhausted, Julia realized that this victory came at a cost. Andrés, bitter and disappointed, resigned from his position, leaving behind a fractured staff and a hospital still struggling to find its way forward. In the weeks that followed, Julia and Martín worked together to rebuild trust within the hospital. Julia knew that she couldn't carry the burden alone, and with Martín's support, she began to delegate more responsibilities, learning to balance her personal life and her passion for her work. As for Andrés, his departure left a lasting impact. His vision had forced Julia to reconsider her own approach, and though she didn't agree with his methods, she couldn't deny that his ambition had pushed her to grow as a leader. In the end, the conflict with Andrés had strengthened her resolve, reminding her that leadership meant not just standing by your principles, but also knowing when to adapt.